In the spring of 1945, as smoke still rose from the ruins of Berlin, and the world held its breath between war and peace, there existed a document that few would ever read. A blueprint for a world that never came to be. The typewriters in the War Department had fallen silent. The planners, exhausted men in rumpled suits who had spent 4 years calculating tonnages, and troop movements now faced a different kind of arithmetic. They were trying to divide a shattered continent, to measure hope against hunger, to count the living among mountains of the dead. In those final weeks of spring, when cherry blossoms fell on Washington while Europe burned, a plan emerged from the depths of American strategic thinking. Not a plan of conquest, but of transformation. It carried no famous name, bore no general signature, existed only in classified folders, marked with urgent stamps. History would barely remember it. Yet within those pages lay an alternative destiny for the world. A fork in the road that humanity would never take. The wind carried ash across the Rhine. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were now geological features. Craters, rubble fields, forests of broken steel reaching toward empty skies. Dresden was a necropolis of melted stone. Hamburg was a wasteland where firestorms had created their own weather systems, winds so hot they had stripped flesh from bone. In the east, beyond the advancing Soviet armies, Warsaw was less than rubble. It was dust, a memory of cobblestones and church bells now ground into powder by systematic demolition. The scale of destruction defied human comprehension. 30 million dead in Europe alone. Entire generations erased. Bloodlines ended. Languages that would never again be spoken by native tongues. The American planners understood what their generals did not yet fully grasp. This was not merely a military victory to be savored, not simply a matter of dictating terms to the defeated. This was a civilizational collapse, a rupture in the fabric of human society so profound that the old rules no longer applied. The men in Washington, many of them economists and political scientists who had watched the Great Depression devour hope in the 1930s, recognized the pattern. They had seen how desperation breeds extremism, how hunger makes monsters of ordinary men, how economic chaos becomes the fertilizer for fascism. They knew, because they had witnessed it once before, that a harsh peace would plant the seeds of the next war. In classified briefing rooms, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like distant bombers, they debated the shape of the post-war order. Some argued for a Carthaginian solution, reduce Germany to an agricultural state, dismantle its industries, ensure it could never again threaten its neighbors. The Morgenthau Plan, named for the Secretary of the Treasury, envisioned a pastoral Germany, its factories torn down, its mines flooded, its people returned to farming with horse-drawn plows. It was vengeance disguised as policy, born from righteous anger at the death camps and the bombed cities. Others saw further ahead. They understood that a starving, humiliated Germany would become a breeding ground for whatever ideology promised redemption and revenge. They had read their history. They knew what had followed the Treaty of Versailles. The alternative plan took shape in meetings where exhausted men drank bitter coffee and smoked endless cigarettes, where blackboards filled with equations, attempting to calculate the cost of mercy. It was radical in its generosity, almost naive in its optimism. Instead of punishing the defeated, America would rebuild them. Instead of extracting reparations, it would pour in capital. Instead of occupying with an iron fist, it would offer partnership. The thinking was both idealistic and pragmatic. A prosperous, democratic Europe would be a stable Europe, a market for American goods, a bulwark against whatever darkness might rise from the ashes. But more than economics animated this vision. There was a genuine belief, perhaps the last gasp of Enlightenment optimism, that the cycle of European wars could finally be broken, that rational self-interest and goodwill might triumph over ancient hatreds. But the plan went further than what would eventually become the Marshall Plan. In those early documents, in proposals that would be quietly shelved and forgotten, American planners envisioned nothing less than a federated Europe, a genuine political union, where national sovereignty would be subordinated to democratic institutions, where borders would be redrawn not by conquest, but by consent, where the very concept of separate nation-states would be transcended. They imagined a European Parliament with real power, a common currency, integrated military forces under international command, economic planning that ignored old territorial divisions. They saw a continent where a German factory worker and a French farmer would share the same passport, answer to the same laws, vote for the same representatives. It was breathtakingly ambitious. It assumed a degree of idealism from war-weary populations that might not exist. It required leaders willing to surrender the very nationalism that had defined their identities. And critically, it depended on Soviet cooperation, or at least acquiescence. In April, as American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River and shook hands in wary friendship, that cooperation still seemed possible. The photographs from Torgau showed smiling soldiers exchanging cigarettes and vodka, embracing like brothers who had survived a common nightmare. The images were genuine. The men who had fought across Europe did feel kinship, did share the soldiers' universal gratitude for survival. But their commanders watched each other with calculating eyes. The race for Berlin had already exposed the fault lines. Churchill, prescient and paranoid in equal measure, had urged Eisenhower to push east, to seize as much German territory as possible before the Soviets arrived. Eisenhower had refused, honoring agreements made at Yalta, believing that post-war cooperation required wartime trust. History would judge that decision harshly, but in the spring of 1945, the shape of the Cold War was not yet fixed. Alternative futures still existed in the realm of possibility. The American plan assumed a level of Soviet reasonableness that even its architects doubted. It required Stalin to accept a democratic, federated Europe on his western border. Essentially, a massive capitalist alliance that would dwarf Soviet power. In exchange, the plan offered economic integration, reconstruction aid even for the Soviet Union, and guaranteed borders. Some planners genuinely believed this was possible. They pointed to Soviet exhaustion, to the devastation that made further expansion suicidal, to Stalin's pragmatic nature that might choose prosperity over ideology. They were catastrophically wrong, but their miscalculation was born from a noble impulse, the belief that even the most hardened dictator might prefer peace to perpetual confrontation. Throughout May, as Germany surrendered in pieces and Nazi officials fled or swallowed cyanide, the diplomatic cables flowed between Washington, London, and Moscow. Churchill, his rhetoric already shifting from wartime ally to cold warrior, saw the Soviet threat with crystalline clarity. His Iron Curtain speech was still a year away, but his thinking had already hardened. He advocated for a strong, rebuilt Germany as a counterweight to Soviet power, a complete reversal of his wartime insistence on harsh treatment for the defeated Reich. The Americans were caught between their idealistic vision and the emerging reality of Soviet intransigence. Roosevelt had died in April, taking with him whatever personal rapport he had built with Stalin. Truman, thrust into power with little preparation, was learning on the job, discovering that the wartime alliance was already dissolving. In June, at Potsdam, the Big Three met for the last time. The conference took place in a mansion that had somehow survived the bombing, surrounded by a devastated city where civilians scavenged for firewood, and children begged American soldiers for chocolate. Stalin arrived by armored train, Churchill by plane, Truman by ship, the modes of transport somehow symbolic of their different relationships to power. The meetings were cordial on the surface, poisonous underneath. Every discussion of borders, reparations, or occupation zones became a negotiation over spheres of influence. The grand American vision of a federated, democratic Europe died in those meetings, though few recognized the death at the time. Stalin made his position clear without stating it directly. The Soviet Union would control Eastern Europe, period. No democratic elections, no Western influence, no compromise. The armies on the ground decided the facts. Everything else was just conversation. The American planners watched their vision crumble. The carefully constructed proposals for European federation went into filing cabinets, then into archives, where they would gather dust for decades. Some of the men who had drafted them felt a profound sense of loss, as if they had glimpsed a better world, only to have it snatched away. Others accepted the new reality with resignation. Realpolitik trumped idealism, as it always had, as it always would. The Marshall Plan would emerge as a consolation prize, a brilliant and generous program that would rebuild Western Europe but accept the continent's division. The American century would be built on that foundation, prosperity on one side of the Iron Curtain, tyranny on the other, and between them the constant threat of annihilation. But in the summer of 1945, before the full horror of the atomic age had revealed itself before the Berlin blockade, and the Korean War before Hungary, and Prague and Afghanistan, there was still a moment when history could have turned differently. If Stalin had been someone else, if Soviet ideology had been less rigid, if the paranoia born from centuries of invasion had not driven every decision, perhaps, if American domestic politics had not turned against foreign aid, if isolationist sentiment had not resurged, if the Republican Congress had not viewed every international commitment as suspect, perhaps, if Churchill had not lost the July election to Labour, if Attlee had possessed more vision or less concern for British imperial interests, perhaps. The historians who would later discover these documents in dusty archives would recognize them as artifacts of a road not taken, evidence of America's brief moment of genuine international idealism before cynicism and Cold War logic took hold. They would note the irony that Europe would eventually move toward the federation that American planners had envisioned, but only after decades of division, only after the Soviet threat had forced Western unity, only after the nations had been so thoroughly humbled that sovereignty seemed less valuable than security. The European Union of the late 20th century would realize, incompletely and imperfectly, the vision that had been drafted in 1945. But by then, America had lost interest, had become suspicious of supranational institutions, had turned inward. In the autumn of 1945, as the Nuremberg trials began, and the world learned the full scale of Nazi atrocities, the last copies of the Comprehensive European Federation Plan were quietly stamped superseded and filed away. The men who had written it moved on to other assignments, other crises, other plans. Some would play crucial roles in shaping the Marshall Plan, in establishing NATO, in building the architecture of the Western Alliance. They would achieve great things, would help create the most successful military alliance in history, would oversee an economic recovery that defied all predictions. But they would always remember the more ambitious dream, the possibility that had briefly existed for something greater than a divided continent living under the shadow of nuclear weapons. The winter of 1945 was brutal. Millions of displaced persons wandered across Europe, searching for homes that no longer existed, for families who were ash in crematorium ovens, for futures that had been stolen. In bombed-out cities, people burned furniture to stay warm, ate from garbage heaps, sold whatever they possessed for a few calories. The victorious armies distributed food and medicine, prevented total collapse, but could not restore what had been destroyed. The scale of trauma was beyond calculation. Every surviving European carried scars, visible and invisible. Trust between nations had been incinerated as thoroughly as the cities. The old continental order of empires and kingdoms was finished. What would replace it remained uncertain. The American planners had imagined a future where this trauma would be collectively processed, where nations would consciously choose to subordinate old grievances to common institutions, where the memory of war would create a determination never to repeat it. They were not entirely wrong. That impulse would eventually drive European integration. But they underestimated the depths of exhaustion, the appeal of nationalism, even after nationalism had led to catastrophe. And most critically, the Soviet Union's determination to secure its western border with puppet states rather than cooperative neighbors. The Cold War was not inevitable in some cosmic sense, but it was the overwhelmingly likely outcome given the personalities, ideologies, and power dynamics of 1945. By 1946, the division was complete. Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, officially declaring what everyone already knew. Stalin tightened his grip on Eastern Europe, eliminating democratic politicians, rigging elections, installing communist governments. The American public, jubilant in victory and eager to bring the boys home, had little appetite for long-term European commitments. The Republican sweep in the 1946 midterm elections brought isolationists and budget hawks to power, men who viewed foreign aid as charity America could not afford. The grand vision of a federated Europe gave way to the more modest goal of stabilizing Western Europe and containing Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, was brilliant in its conception and generous in its execution. Billions of dollars flowed into Europe, rebuilding infrastructure, stabilizing currencies, reviving industries. But it was also an acknowledgement of failure, a recognition that the continent would remain divided, that Eastern Europe was lost, that the best America could hope for was a prosperous democratic West strong enough to resist Soviet pressure. The plan's architects sometimes wondered, in private moments, what might have been if they had been able to implement the more ambitious program drafted in 1945. Would a unified federated Europe have been strong enough to resist Soviet intimidation? Would Stalin have backed down faced with overwhelming economic power? Or would it have simply triggered war sooner, before America had the nuclear monopoly that paradoxically kept the peace? These questions have no answers, because history offers no controlled experiments. We can only observe what happened and imagine what might have been. The Cold War lasted 4 decades, cost trillions of dollars, killed millions in proxy wars across the developing world, and brought humanity to the brink of extinction multiple times. Yet it also drove technological innovation, forced Western nations to maintain the social safety nets that prevented the return of fascism, and eventually ended without the nuclear apocalypse that had seemed inevitable. The divided Europe of the Cold War was far from the ideal envisioned in 1945, but it was also far better than the alternatives that haunted the nightmares of strategic planners: a Soviet Europe, a nuclear wasteland, or another conventional war that would have finished what Hitler had started. The documents themselves, when historians finally examined them decades later, revealed the thinking of men who still believed in progress, who thought reason could triumph over historical forces, who imagined that institutions and goodwill might overcome the darker aspects of human nature. Reading them in the cynical light of later decades, after Vietnam and Iraq, after the collapse of faith in American exceptionalism, after the recognition that even the best intentions can lead to disaster, these documents seem almost touchingly naive. Yet they also reveal something admirable: a genuine desire to break the cycle of European wars, a willingness to sacrifice short-term advantage for long-term stability, a belief that the post-war world could be better than the pre-war world. The men who drafted these plans knew the history of peacemaking after great wars. They had studied the Congress of Vienna, which had established a system that maintained relative peace for a century. They had analyzed the failures of Versailles, where vindictiveness and weakness had combined to create the conditions for Hitler's rise. They understood that the decisions made in 1945 would echo for generations. They tried, within the constraints of their knowledge and their time, to create something new, a genuinely cooperative international system where war between major powers would become obsolete. They failed, but their failure was more noble than many successes. In the archives of the State Department, in boxes rarely opened, these documents remain, evidence of a path not taken, a future that never arrived. Graduate students occasionally discover them, write dissertations analyzing their contents, speculate about alternate histories. But for the most part, they are forgotten, overshadowed by the plans that were actually implemented, by the Cold War that actually happened, by the world we actually inhabit. Yet their existence matters, because they remind us that history is not predetermined, that different choices were possible, that the world we know is not the only world that could have been. The summer of 1947 brought drought to Europe, threatening the fragile recovery. The Marshall Plan aid arrived just in time, preventing catastrophe, beginning the long process of reconstruction. In Washington, the men who had once envisioned a federated Europe watched as their more modest plan succeeded beyond expectations. Western Europe recovered faster than anyone had predicted, creating prosperous democracies that would endure. It was a triumph of American generosity and European resilience. But on quiet evenings, some of those planners would pull out the old documents, the comprehensive proposals for European federation, and wonder, what if Stalin had been more flexible? What if American domestic politics had allowed for greater commitments? What if the horror of the atomic bomb had been sufficient to convince leaders that the old system of competing nation-states was suicidal? These questions haunted the Cold War generation, the men and women who lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons, who practiced duck and cover drills in schools, who built bomb shelters in their backyards, who understood that human civilization could end in an afternoon. The division of Europe, which had seemed like a temporary measure in 1945, hardened into permanent reality. The Berlin Wall went up in 1961, a concrete manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a monument to failure. Families were divided, friends separated, lovers torn apart. The soldiers who had embraced at the Elbe became enemies, pointing weapons at each other across barbed wire. The dream of a unified, peaceful Europe became a bitter joke, replaced by the grim reality of mutual assured destruction. Yet throughout those decades, the memory of the 1945 proposals lingered in the minds of European leaders who had experienced the war. Adenauer in Germany, Schuman in France, de Gasperi in Italy. These men understood viscerally that the old system of competing nationalisms led only to destruction. They began slowly, modestly, with economic cooperation, the coal and steel community, then the common market. They built institutions designed to make war between France and Germany impossible by intertwining their economies so thoroughly that conflict would be mutual suicide. This was not the Grand Federation imagined by American planners, but it was a start, a seed that would grow slowly over decades into something approximating that original vision. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Europe had been divided for 2 generations. Those who remembered the unified continent of before 1945 were elderly or dead. The division seemed natural, permanent, perhaps even necessary. Yet within 2 years, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended, and suddenly the possibility of a unified Europe returned. The European Union expanded eastward, embracing former communist states, extending prosperity and democracy to nations that had suffered under Soviet domination. It was messy, incomplete, troubled by economic crises and nationalist backlashes. Britain would eventually leave, disillusioned by bureaucracy and immigration. Eastern members would drift toward authoritarianism. The euro would nearly collapse in the 2010s. Yet, despite all its flaws, the EU represented something unprecedented. A voluntary union of formerly warring nations, a genuine attempt to transcend nationalism and create common institutions. The men who had drafted those 1945 documents were mostly dead by the time the EU achieved this form. A few survived long enough to see it, to recognize in its structure and purpose echoes of what they had imagined half a century earlier. They must have felt vindicated, even if the path to that destination had been far longer and more painful than they had hoped. History had proven them right in their core insight. That peace in Europe required the subordination of national sovereignty to common institutions, that prosperity required integration, that the alternative to cooperation was catastrophe. They had simply been too early, too optimistic about how quickly traumatized nations could embrace such a radical vision. In the end, the American plan that could have changed the post-war world did change it. Just not when or how its authors intended. The ideas contained in those forgotten documents influenced the Marshall Plan, shaped the thinking of European leaders, provided intellectual ammunition for those who fought for integration against nationalist resistance. The vision of a federated Europe did not die in the filing cabinets. It went dormant, waiting for conditions that would allow it to germinate. When the Cold War ended and those conditions finally arrived, the seeds planted in 1945 could finally grow. The lesson, perhaps, is that grand visions rarely succeed on their first attempt. They fail, retreat, wait, and emerge again when circumstances align. The men who drafted those plans in 1945 could not create the federated Europe they imagined because Stalin and the Cold War made it impossible. But by articulating that vision, by showing that alternatives existed to the traditional system of competing nation-states, they provided a blueprint for future generations. Ideas have their own momentum, separate from the fate of the individuals who first conceive them. The thought that European nations could voluntarily unite, that war between them could become unthinkable, that common prosperity could transcend ancient hatreds. This thought, once planted, could not be entirely uprooted even by Soviet tanks and nuclear weapons. The wind still carries ash across the Rhine, though now it is industrial pollution, rather than the residue of war. The cities that were rubble in 1945 have been rebuilt, their medieval cores carefully reconstructed, their modern quarters gleaming with prosperity. A German worker and a French farmer do share a common currency, do answer to some of the same laws, do vote for a European Parliament. It is not the world imagined in those 1945 documents. It is messier, more complicated, less idealistic. But it is also more real, forged not from abstract principles, but from the hard lessons of experience, from the understanding that comes only through suffering that the alternative to cooperation is hell. Those who visit the archives, who read through the yellowing pages of the Forgotten Plan, cannot help but feel a strange mixture of regret and hope. Regret for the decades wasted in Cold War confrontation, for the millions who died in proxy wars, for the families divided by the Iron Curtain, for the nuclear terror that poisoned the dreams of a generation. Hope because the vision did not die, because Europe did eventually unite, because the cycle of war that had defined the continent for centuries was finally broken. The American plan that never happened became, in the end, the European plan that did. Delayed, modified, imperfect, but real.